Hello friends, I'm Shannon Makes, historical sewist by day, circus artist by night, and this is the behind the seams for my Wartime Knit, this lovely World War II era V-necked vest. If you are new here and you haven't seen the main video, I definitely recommend you go and check that out first to get a better sense of the project. And for those of you that have seen the main video, welcome back and thanks so much for joining me. So a behind the seams video is a chance for those of you who are interested in any specific project to come join me here in a more casual, unscripted setting to chat about all the fun little details of a project that maybe didn't make the main video, whether that's because of time constraints or artistic decisions, whatever. It can include extra tips and tricks, outtakes, mistakes, maybe some extra in-depth looks at construction, all that type of stuff. So what will I be covering in this behind the seams? Well, I'll be talking a little bit about the setting where I did the filming because it's kind of an interesting little cabin in the woods with some really fun history. And then I'm going to be going through just some very basic technical details about the yarn and the needles that I used. And from there, I'll go through a rundown of just the basics of making this garment. From the bottom to the top, from the front to the back, how it went together, all that sort of stuff. I'll also mention what I think the motivation might have been behind some certain design decisions that the pattern writers made, because that was, to me, actually kind of the most interesting part of this entire project, and I'd love to share it with you. I'll be including some extra clips and visuals where they're relevant or useful, but these behind the scenes videos will not necessarily be the highly edited visual symphonies that I strive for with my main videos, but they should be just great to put on in the background if you have some of your own knitting or hand sewing to do, and it's also hopefully going to be really useful if you're interested in knitting this pattern up for yourselves. So, let's get started, shall we? Okay, so first things first, about that cabin in the woods. Well, it's actually a friend's house in Småland, and that's not just where you leave your children when you want to get lost in IKEA, but it is in fact an entire region in Sweden. And the house, with the exception of a couple decades around the 60s, has been in his family since the early 1900s. There are some absolutely amazing photos he's got hanging up there of his relatives that lived there, that built the cabin. It's his great-grandfather and his grandfather, and then all of their siblings, and all of those children in the photo lived in that house back then, and it is a very small cabin. You saw almost all of it in the original video. The only rooms that I didn't film in was the upstairs, which is just two very small bedrooms. So you can imagine all of those children kind of just spreading out on the main floor, probably in front of the fire, to sleep at night. But it is a very amazing little cabin. It's just got some great ambiance, a magnificent fireplace, and made for a beautiful warm toasty place to sit and knit my vest. So nextly, let's move on to the technical details of this vest, and I had a lot of questions about the needles and the yarn, so let's start first with the yarn. So as I showed in the video, it is a Cascades 220 yarn in the colorway Olive Heather, and I will throw all of the other relevant details up on the screen here for you. In terms of the quantity that you'll need, if you're planning on making this pattern up verbatim following the exact size that the booklet gives, which is what I did, you'll need between 3 and 4 skeins of yarn, and I wish I could give you a more accurate estimate, but in a very period accurate technique, I actually unraveled the beginning of an old UFO that was abandoned in my basement. It was originally going to be a sweater, and then it got forgotten many years ago, so I unraveled that, and I'm not sure how much yarn was in that. So I would say you might be able to do it with 3, but you might be pushing it, and I would say that 4 skeins should be ample. But when I found it, I knew I was definitely going to be using this yarn because it was perfect in pretty much every regard. It was free, it was a good color, it was a great weight, and it was made out of wool. The fact that it was yarn was nice not only because it was a period accurate fiber and wool was super important to the wartime knits in general, but also because it allowed me to try some period accurate techniques such as the spit splice, which I had never used before, and it doesn't work with synthetic fibers, so that was a really nice find. About the color, technically this is not a period accurate color. It should have been either olive drab, which is basically khaki, or some version of blue if it was being made for the Marines or Navy. The instructions say that the Women's Service Military Corps should use the same color as the service that they're attached to, so its color is a bit more of a nod to its military origins, but it's not in fact period accurate. So once I had the yarn, then the next step was to find my needles, and of course this was also not straightforward because that required me to do a conversion between the vintage needle sizes and the current needle sizes, and that was a little bit tricky. It involved some digging around on the internet. But both Melissa of So Biased, who is the one who introduced me both to the World War II Sewing Challenge itself and posted the knitting booklet that I got this from in the first place, she independently of me came to the same conclusions, so I'm pretty sure that we're on the right track. The pattern lists that it needs size 10 and size 12 needles, and that translates into a 3.25 millimeter needle and a 2.75 millimeter needle. I do not know what the modern sizes are, so I just went with the metric actual standards. So that was a great starting point. And then from there, I decided that it would be wise to do some sort of a gauge swatch to check, if it was going to be the right size needle with the yarn and everything, because this pattern actually gives a gauge, which from what I hear is kind of uncommon in vintage patterns. It makes a lot of sense in this context because the Red Cross is trying to highly standardize all of the garments it's providing for the soldiers, and I'm actually going into that in a ton more detail in my next video, which I just finished the script for today. That is the history of wartime knits. But a lot of the reasons that this pattern is really nice and really easy to work with, even for someone like me, I've never knit really a garment besides, a scarf, and I think maybe a hat. But this pattern was a really great sort of introductory dive into vintage patterns because the Red Cross went to a large effort to make the patterns really clear and understandable for people who didn't necessarily have the most experience with knitting. So they did give a sort of gauge. They call it the stitch tension. So with that, I did a little, maybe roughly 4x4 inch swatch pattern. I should have done it probably in the actual pattern of the vest here. I did not because I was, honestly, mostly because I was too lazy. I was also a bit tight on time, and I knew that being a vest and it not having shoulders, I did have a bit of leeway. So I just went and I did mine in stockinette stitch, and the first little bit that I did was running a bit big when I did it on my larger needles, so I switched and I did a swatch on my smaller needles, and that was very close to gauge. It ran pretty much exactly on in terms of the width, and then the height. It was running a bit tall, as I talked about in the main video, but not tall enough that I was overly concerned about it, and I figured I would just kind of keep tracking the height as I went, and if I needed to adjust, I was pretty confident that I could figure out how to adjust if that was a problem, and worst case, I just ended up with a vest that was a little bit longer than it was supposed to be.
not the end of the world. So for the cast on, I used an alternating cable cast on. I am just gonna throw a link to the tutorial that I myself used in the description so that if any of you out there watching want to just follow exactly what I did, because I know there definitely can be some decision paralysis when it comes to casting on. There's a million different ways to cast on and the pattern itself doesn't specify. So that link is in the description and I used it because it's basically invisible. The edges kind of blend right into the beginning ribbing pattern. So I definitely recommend it. It's also nice and stretchy, which is an extra bonus. Then for the ribbing, really easy, just jump into a 1x1 ribbing pattern, knit one, purl one, gives that nice stretchy band at the bottom. They called for 30 rows in their pattern, and just doing some quick math, if 9 rows is supposed to equal 1 inch, then 30 rows was gonna be just over 3 inches, and I just thought that was too long for my taste. Plus I knew that I was gonna possibly have a bit of extra height in just because my needles are running a bit big. So I cut that down to about 20 rows and I think it looks quite nice. So then from there, I just jumped right into the pattern, and with the exception of the first 2 stitches and the last 2 stitches, basically every row is broken into a 15 stitch long pattern that just repeats itself, and that kind of creates the columns that you see on the vest. Each column here is basically 15 stitches long, and you just repeat it across the whole row, so you kind of get really good at those patterns pretty quickly there. And I found it super helpful to go ahead and put some stitch markers between each set. So every 15 stitches I had a stitch marker. It helped me visually sort of break up the whole mass of the row into those nice little sections. Super helpful at first when I was getting used to the pattern. But honestly, even after I got to the point where I knew the pattern by heart, I just kept them on still because I found that it helped me catch my mistakes much quicker than if I didn't have them, kind of acting as landmarks to kind of center yourself on. And then when it comes to the pattern itself, it was really pretty easy, so I highly recommend, even if you've never done cables, to at least just go watch a tutorial and see if you think you could tackle it, because I'm pretty sure that you can. I believe in you. One thing I will point out, that even though the pattern itself actually does include instructions on how to do a knit twist and a purl twist, which is amazing. It was fantastic because I had never done them before. There is a typo. So then once I got into the rhythm of it, it actually went super fast, and I say that relatively speaking because my knitting speed is still, like, my knitting style is a very slow style. Basically, I think the slowest style that exists out there. I actually blame that on the war, and I will explain more about that in my history of wartime knits video. But I clocked myself on one of the cable rows, and I came in at like just under 5 minutes for one row. And then of course the back side goes faster because there are no cables or twists on the back side. But even so, it still took me more than a week of some pretty intense knitting sessions to get the whole vest done. But then again, as I think everyone knows, trying to film it and get some nice interesting angles also eats up a lot of time there. So hopefully if you do it, you either aren't on a time deadline or you have a faster knitting style than me. So then the next step is shaping the armholes. It's super easy. You just decrease by 1 stitch on the either side of the vest, and then the instructions walk you through how to do that decrease, and then you just continue decreasing by 2 stitches every second row until you've worked 10 inches. Definitely I found that very helpful. I remembered to mark when I started to decrease, so I had that marker there, and then I could just measure 10 inches from that. And I will mention, because this being the first garment that I knit, I did not know whether you were supposed to measure 10 inches going straight up from where you started the decreases, or 10 inches following the curve of the armhole that you're shaping, and it turns out it's the former. So keep that in mind. So once you've got your 10 inches done, then it tells you to cast off for the shoulder portion, and they tell you how to do that precisely. And that leaves you with a chunk of 34 stitches in the middle, which is going to form the back of the collar. And those stitches, it just tells you to go increase from 34 to 40 stitches. It doesn't tell you how to, but I think it works best, or it looks the best, if you just add a stitch every 5th stitch. That way your additional stitches are sort of evenly distributed. And then you knit this again in a 1x1 ribbing, and you're supposed to switch back to the smaller needles, but because I was already using my smaller needles and I was at a cabin in the middle of nowhere and didn't have smaller needles, I just did the whole thing in one size. I will tell you it worked just fine for the collar, so if you're in a similar situation, don't worry too much about it. And then you cast off loosely. The front is basically the same as the back. It just gets a little bit more complicated because right here you split it onto 2 sets of needles, because you have to kind of knit this as one and then cast off here, and then knit this and cast off. It does mean that you need to have somewhere to put a half of these stitches while you're working on the other half, so an extra knitting needle, or if you have one of those like giant safety pins that are meant to hold stitches for knitting projects. Even honestly, an extra piece of yarn would work in the same way you would use it like as a lifeline. You could do it, it would just be a little bit more annoying to kind of put them back on the knitting needle afterwards. So then at this point I've got the back finished and I've got the front finished to the point where I've cast off the shoulders, and then I was about to pick up the stitches to do the ribbing on the neckline, and then I just kind of like thought about it, and I was like, why can't I just knit the whole neckline as one piece? That seems like it would make a whole lot more sense, instead of making the back collar part of the back piece and the front collar part of the front piece, because then you have to sew them together, and then there's this like a little bit of an extra bulk here where you've sewn the neckline together. But you could just pick up stitches on both sides of the front and the back at the same time, and then do all of the ribbed boarding all at once, and it just seemed like it would make so much more sense to me, because why would you have an extra seam line there? And then I like hemmed and hawed over this decision. I asked the knitters in the CosTube community if they had sort of suggestions and advice, and in the end I just ended up deciding, okay, well, I'll do it the way the instructions tell me, because I want to try and do the pattern following the directions as much as I can sort of method, and maybe I'll sort of understand the logic behind that decision as I do it. And it turns out that actually it totally hit me. As I was picking up the stitches to do this, I was sitting there thinking about it, and I realized that if I was going to knit the entire neckline as one piece uninterrupted, I would have had to have cable needles, or possibly like a lot of double pointed needles. And the thing is that these instructions are meant to be as accessible as possible to as many knitters as possible in order to make as many garments for the soldiers as possible. And writing a pattern that required you to have an additional set of tools meant that you limited the number of people who were able to do this pattern. That, and then the other thing that I realized a little bit later on was also that there was like a huge need for socks as well. And socks also, you have to have double pointed needles to knit socks, so it could be also that they didn't want to take double pointed needles away from the sock knitting effort, or it could be a combination of all these things. But I thought it was really cool that it was something that I kind of discovered as I was making it. And actually the reason that it came to mind was because I, again, was in a cabin in the middle of the woods. I didn't pack any sort of cable needles or double pointing needles. I was really limited in the tools that I had, and if the pattern had called for additional tools, I wouldn't have been able to make the pattern. And that's kind of what started me thinking about, like, okay, well, maybe this is actually an accessibility issue, because clearly the Red Cross is going to great lengths to try to make this pattern really easy, really accessible, so that lots of people can make it. So that was, like, I think actually one of the coolest parts about making this vest, was that little bit of like experimental archaeology that I stumbled onto. So once I had figured that all out and had picked up all my stitches, I went ahead and knit the neckline, and I knew I wanted, there's a certain way that the neckline looks so that the decreases look really nice and sharp. It's called a mitered decrease. I will link the video tutorial that I used again down in the description, because I am not going to try and give a tutorial. I've literally only done it once, but with great success. I think it looks fantastic. So after I've got my mitered decrease and I cast off, then it was time to join the front and the back up here at the shoulder. And I don't even remember exactly how I did that, but in retrospect, I would have used the 3 needle bind off, which I will again link down in the description. And then with my front and back joined, I decided to go ahead and knit the armbands before I blocked it all. So I went ahead and picked up all of the stitches for that. And then once again, it's a very simple 1x1 ribbing pattern. It just gives this really cute little armband here. It's a really nice little touch. The one thing I will say about this is the one spot that I do wish I would have had smaller needles, because the armband is the only part that there's like, it's like a little bit flapping off my back. Like it's not quite as tight as I would have liked it. So in retrospect, I would have either tried to use smaller needles, or in my case, because I didn't have them, I think I would have worked some decreases in there so that there were just fewer overall stitches, and that way the ribbing would actually be a little bit under tension instead of right now it's a little bit like flying loose in the wind. And then after that, I just moved on to the blocking. It was, again, my first time blocking something. I quite enjoyed it. I thought it was super fun. There are tons of tutorials out there. If you don't have a blocking mat, it's not a big deal. What I did, I laid down a plastic garbage bag and then a towel, and then I laid out that top piece of fabric, which I highly recommend doing. The reason I used that extra layer of fabric was because it had a grid pattern on it. It was just some fabric I had laying around. It had that nice checkered pattern on it, and that was really useful for making sure that my knitting stayed nice and square when I blocked it, so it wasn't like a little bit like a parallelogram in the end. So that was pretty much it for me for the blocking process. One funny little thing is actually that you can see in the video when I'm laying out the blocking, I'm in one room, and it's because at that point it was quite late both in my stay at the cabin and also quite late in the day, and that was the only room that was getting proper light to film because it was windows on 3 sides. But it's like a 3-season porch. It's not insulated. In fact, actually there are intentionally gaps where the roof meets the ceiling, so like birds are flying in and out of there sometimes. So I suspected that it probably wasn't gonna dry very well, and sure enough, by like midnight right before I went to bed, I checked it and it was still, not only was it cold out there, but it was still very wet. So what I did was I dragged it in and I put it in the room in front of the fireplace. Just, that room has the most heat in the house, but of course in the process of doing it, some of the needles got a little bit wibbly and shifted a little bit, and then at one point I think Phil actually stepped on the corner, and you can actually see that corner is like a little bit stretched out and like dragging down. It was not a big deal in the end. It gave me a tiny bit of a hassle when sewing it together, but it really wasn't a big deal or anything. It was just kind of a funny tribute to like trying to do YouTube in the middle of the woods. And yeah, even so, then the next morning came down, it was dry, fantastic, and it was time to sew it up. And I just learned a couple days ago that apparently some of you hate this step of the process, which is hilarious because I found it my favorite part. It was very relaxing. After spending such a long time knitting it and it's such a slow process, it's so fun to just see the stitches like pull together. I thought it was amazing. I'll come and I'll sew all of your guys' garments together. Like, it's fantastic. Reflecting on the changes I would make if I could go back in time. Number 1, either using smaller needles or doing some decreases for that armband so it is a little bit tighter. Number 2 then would be definitely that I would join the shoulder seams with a different technique. As mentioned before, 3 needle bind off. I think that's probably the way to go. And lastly, I'd modify the pattern ever so slightly so that instead of having a 2-stitch border on either edge of the pattern, it would actually have a 3-stitch border, and that is because when you are sewing the front to the back with the mattress stitch kind of eats one of those stitches from each edge. Just that's the way how it is. So when I had 2 regular knit stitches on either side and I was sewing them together, that mattress stitch kind of ate those up, they disappeared, and these 2 kind of left me with a column of 2 stitches, which it looked quite clean, but the problem is that all of the other columns on the vest are 4 stitches wide, and that just kind of bugs me a tiny bit. So by having a 3-stitch border on each side when you would go to sew them together, and these ones would get eaten by the mattress stitch, it would leave you with 4 stitches, and then it would match and you wouldn't be able to tell at all where the vest was seamed, and that would make me so happy. It's just a tiny little detail, but I think it would look quite nice. So that's it for this session of Behind the Seams. I hope that you learned something. If you're thinking about making this vest, I highly encourage it. It's a fairly good pattern for someone who's like an advanced beginner. If you thought it was useful, go ahead, give the video a like, and stick around for some other more edited together, polished content later on, and definitely check out the history of wartime knitting because I am just so exciting with that one. I'm brimming with random bits of wartime knitting trivia. So thank you, and I will catch you guys in the next video.